Welcome and good evening, everyone. My name is Tim Smith. I'm the operations manager for Nicholas Books and Schuler Books. Pleased to welcome you to our event tonight with Micheline Maynard, author of Satisfaction Guaranteed: How Zingermans Built a Corner Deli into a Global Food Community. Before we get started, first off, I want to show everyone a picture of the book by holding it up here. Such a fabulous cover on this book in the classic Zingerman style. We want to just go over a few housekeeping items for everybody before we get started. First off, we want to have all of you who are attending the event have an opportunity to ask your questions and participate in tonight's event. Please feel free to put your questions into the chat. If it is a question, please put a Q in front of it so that I can see it clearly. If you do happen to put it in the Q&A, I'll see it there as well. And I'll be checking those as we're talking. I'll get us started with some questions, and then I'll be filtering in your questions as we go along as well. Also, would like to let you know that this conversation is being recorded and will be able to be viewed on our YouTube channel in a few days, along with many of our other past events. So feel free to check that out. Also, if you don't already have your copy of the book, please feel free to order your copy at nicholasbooks.com or schulerbooks.com. The links to the book are right in the chat. If you prefer audiobooks, Libro FM is a way to go for those, and that link is there also. Now, without further delay, I would like to introduce you to our guest this evening. Micheline Maynard is a contributing columnist with the Washington Post. She's also been a senior editor at NPR's Here and Now. She was a senior correspondent and Detroit bureau chief for the New York Times, and she writes for a variety of publications, including the Ann Arbor Observer also. She's also had a lot of different experiences with Zingermans, which you'll hear about in the book and through this conversation tonight through the years. And she's now providing us with this wonderful book that, gosh, I so enjoyed, and I hope you all will as well if you haven't already. And it goes well into what makes Zingerman such a unique place and a fabulous place to visit when you're in Ann Arbor. Micheline, welcome. I'm so excited to be talking to you tonight about your book.
Thanks so much for having me. Hi, everybody.
Hi, so we've got people in the chat, and so I'll kind of get us started. So you started off writing about the auto industry and business. What kind of transitioned you into food?
So I've always been the person in the press corps that picked the restaurant and, corralled 24 people out for dinner and things like that. And in 2007, so just to back up a little bit, I'm from Ann Arbor, moved away and come back 7 times. And I did not go to Zingerman's when it first opened, but when I came back from Washington, D.C. in the mid-90s, I started to discover Zingerman's classes. So I was taking all kinds of classes at Zingerman's: cheese making, gelato, flatbreads, cookies, a pie class where I cried because I couldn't get the pie dough to roll out. And in 2007, I was assigned by the New York Times, to go cover the Paris Motor Show. And I had forgotten that I had sent in a note to Patricia Wells, the food writer, cookbook writer, who teaches classes in both Paris and Provence. And one day I got an email saying, there's an opening in one of her classes. You have to respond in 2 weeks. And I looked at the dates, and it was right after the Paris Motor Show. And I looked at my budget and I thought for about 5 minutes. And then I said, okay, I'm going to go to this cooking class. So Patricia, I don't know if people have the Food Lover's Guide to Paris or Bistro Cooking or any of her other wonderful cookbooks, but she can be a little intimidating when you first meet her, and you go to a separate apartment that she has in Paris just for teaching cooking. And you are given a partner who you don't know at the beginning of class. You're given a card and a mise en place. Everything's laid out so you can cook. and you start preparing your portion of the lunch. And so Patricia circles the room, and she came up behind me, and I thought, oh, my gosh, I've gotten something terribly wrong. And she leaned over and she said, "You can cook." And I thought, holy cow, and the reason I could cook was maybe my mother's teaching and the Zingermans classes. So I was covering the airline industry bankruptcies. I was covering the auto industry bankruptcies. I worked for NPR on a project looking at the future of the industrial Midwest. And a few years ago, I just decided, what really excites me is not dying industries. It's writing about food, but also writing about food from a business point of view, not just, oh, this tastes wonderful, or oh, this presentation is gorgeous. But I really love talking to owners and chefs and servers and other people about the mechanics of their business. So I guess if you sort of throw all that together in a nice salad, that's how I ended up taking the path to writing this book.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So one of the things that you talk about a little bit is how Ari and Paul met and started Zingermans. Tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. So last week was Zingerman's Deli's actual 40th anniversary. And Ari and Paul talked about the misconceptions of how they met, none of which are in my book, I'll tell you. The way they met was Paul, both of them went to U of M. Paul's from Detroit, Ari's from Chicago. Paul had gone to work in restaurants in Ann Arbor. One was called Maud's, no longer there, but a lot of us ate there when we were kids. And also the Real Seafood Company, which is still there, people will know. And he was a couple years out of Michigan and had become a manager. And Ari came in one day looking for a job, and Paul hired him as dishwasher. And they worked together, and I think Paul was kind of watching him like, does he have potential? And they started to have conversations about all kinds of topics. Ari's a very cerebral, thoughtful, kind of intellectual, and Paul is very interested in business and business philosophy. And they started to exchange books back and forth. They would lie out in the sun on their day off and read a business book and hand it to the other, and Ari would read something philosophical and hand it over to Paul. And so they had kind of a meeting of minds, but the famous partnership didn't happen right away because Ari went out to San Francisco for a while, and Paul was kind of rising within what's called Main Street Ventures here in Ann Arbor, this restaurant company. One of the things that they both agreed on was that Ann Arbor could use a really great deli, like the old school delis in Detroit or Chicago or New York, with the appetizers and the corned beef sandwiches. And we just didn't have that here in Ann Arbor. We had some sandwich places, but not a true Jewish deli. And so they both kind of had this dream. Didn't happen immediately. They didn't they didn't dream it up in their dorm room. They didn't actually have the money right away to do it. And both of them, Paul actually went to work at Monahan Seafood, which is still in business in Ann Arbor. And Mike Monahan loved fish and pulled Paul into that business, but they still had this dream about doing a deli. And one day in an area of Ann Arbor called Carytown, a little brick building went on the market for lease. And they went over there and they just said, you know what, I think now is the time to do our deli. And so it all came together. At that point, it started to come together. One of the big hurdles for them was financing.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, so this was 1982, and I don't know if people will remember, but interest rates were in double digits and inflation was in double digits. And, our parents were getting 14% on certificates of deposit, but it also meant that if you wanted to borrow money, you were paying double digits. And so they went looking for a loan, and nobody would lend to them. I mean, first of all, the idea of starting a deli in a recession sounded really, far-fetched. And then they found a lender in Ann Arbor, and he agreed to lend to them at 2% over prime, and the prime rate was 20%. So they got a 22% loan. Paul had access to $20,000. They borrowed $20,000, and Ari had some money from his grandmother. And they pooled, and Mike Monahan kicked in, and they pooled it, and they were able to get just enough money to open. And they did.
Awesome.
March
Yeah.
15, 1982.
That's great. Yeah. And I'm having a hard time remembering the name of the distributor, but like it was one of my favorite stories in the book is how one of their distributors that they hooked up with really early for bread, I think it was.
Ginsburg.
Yeah, it was
Man. So,
like just so enthusiastic about them succeeding that he like would build time into his route to stay and help them get started and things like that. It was such
he
a great.
takes a lot of credit for and he's a great guy. He takes a lot of credit for Zingerman's success, as he probably deserves some credit for it. You know, he was someone in Detroit who was well known in the deli business and had a business consulting delis around the country. And he came out and he looked at the deli building. He said, "You guys don't have any parking, I mean, first of all, and this is a small kitchen." And the kitchen was in the basement at that point. And he taught them how to cure corned beef. He taught them the importance of the right kind of rye bread, which is, as a rye person yourself, you will understand. W-R-Y and R-Y-E. Basically, it's a twice baked loaf to get the crispy out exterior that they wanted. And then he was surprised that they used Swiss cheese from Switzerland, because none of the American delis were using actual Swiss cheese. And you know, it was really tough for them at the beginning, because the products that they needed were, you know, Ann Arbor is about 45 minutes from Detroit, and they would have to make multiple trips during the day. And Lori Saginaw, who's Paul's wife, would make a drive-in and go get big bags of rye bread, and Cy would bring the corned beef, and everybody was pitching in at that point. I mean, for me, it's just amazing that it's grown into this enterprise, because it really was a collection of, you know, about 10 people that got the whole thing off the ground.
Yeah, it is, you know, really interesting to see what it has developed into after, you know, 40 years, and has obviously evolved a ton in that amount of time. Talk a little bit, if you would, about kind of what their philosophy about running a business is, and how that's helped them grow into what they are.
So there's a book called Start with Why, W-H-Y, that a lot of business people have probably read. And one of the things that the author talks about is that you can't start out with a goal of making $70 million. That's not your why. Your why is the reason that you want your business to exist. And so for Paul and Ari, the why is what they call a three-legged stool, and it's good food, good service, and good finances. And they don't say good profits, because the thing about Zingermans is they don't make huge net incomes at Zingermans. It's pretty much double digit, because they're investing money back into the business. They're growing the business. They're paying benefits. They're paying bonuses, and they're training people like crazy. So one of the big things that Zingermans really focuses on is training employees, training the managing partners at each of the businesses. And I'll give you an example. I think some people who are with us tonight might remember Jacobson's, the department store. And my jobs in high school and college were at Jacobson's in Ann Arbor and East Lansing. And then, of course, we shopped at a lot of the Jacobsons too. So when I started as a gift wrapper, and then they allowed me to go on the selling floor. And when I started as a saleswoman, they gave me an order book, you know, the receipts. They showed me how to run a credit card sale. They showed me the code to use if somebody was shoplifting. And then they said, okay, you know, your colleagues will just show you what to do, and just pick it up from them. And I did. And my mother had worked at Marshall Fields, so I knew a little bit about the department store business. Well, that doesn't happen at Zingerman's. So when you get there, essentially you're given a training contract. There's an agreement. Here is what we want you to learn the first day, the first week, the first month, the first 2 months. In return, we promise to teach you X, Y, and Z. Actually, it's the whole alphabet. And everybody marks off a check mark when a new skill is taught. One of the interesting things is that they have to teach people how to use the phones, because the younger people coming in now use, they use their cell phones, and you don't put, you might put something on hold on your cell phone, but they're on all the buttons and the transfers and all that stuff. And so everybody gets taught how to open, if you're working in retail, how to open and close, how to use the phones, how to talk correctly to a customer. If you work in retail sales in the deli, you don't just point, you walk them over. You have to be educated on all the different kinds of olive oils and cheeses and all that. And so I think that is something that the customer doesn't necessarily know is happening, but they definitely benefit from what's happening. And then beyond that, they have some very kind of 50,000 foot view philosophies. So one of them is called servant leadership. So any of the owners of those businesses, Ari and Paul, when Paul's in town, they are as likely to be waiting on you or helping as, a person making $16 an hour. Anybody in that company will step in and assist the customer. And if it's not a retail customer, it might be a training customer or a wedding customer, everybody's empowered to participate. And they have a concept called visioning, which I find very interesting. And it's not original to Zingerman's, but Zingerman's has really become known for visioning. And in that case, you pick a date in the future and you write like a little short story saying, it's 2032. And actually the vision for 2032 is in the book. And in 2032, Zingerman's will be a more sustainable company. We will reduce our carbon footprint. We hope to add 3 or 4 more new businesses. We hope that by then we've come up with a plan so that when Ari and Paul want to retire, the managing partners will be the owners of all of Zingerman's, et cetera, et cetera. And then it isn't how you'll do it, it's what you want it to look like. And then you fill in as you go along.
Yeah, I love that part of what they do. And we have not gone through their specific training on that, but we focus, especially in our marketing department, a lot on that. So
Yeah.
it's been really interesting to read a little bit more about what their process is for that.
Yeah, and they teach it across the food industry. Well, not just the food industry, but to a lot of people in business. And there's one young woman, Kat Gordon, who's down in Memphis, and she is so into the concept that along with running a bakery, she just renovated and put in a classroom, a teaching classroom, so she can teach not only like pies and cookies, but visioning.
Yeah.
So, and she's got their permission to, to teach the Zingerman's way of visioning. And it just is an example of how their philosophy kind of spreads across the food industry.
Yeah, and like you said, I mean, even non-food businesses, it's one of their sort of businesses within the Zingerman's family of businesses is their training process that anyone can enroll in.
Yeah, they've had, I think the most high profile people are in the restaurant industry. So Rick Bayless, who people will know from Chicago, he was one of the very first customers for Zing Train. And Joanne Chang in Boston, who has the wonderful flour bakery and cafe, she's got up to 10 of those now. And she has sent her people to Zingerman's. And Alon Shaya down in New Orleans, and T. Martin at Commander's Palace in New Orleans, and people from all over the country send their employees or their managers, either send them to Ann Arbor, and now they've been doing virtual training, more of that. But it's really, it's really a way for Zingerman's to kind of be the middle of a wheel, and then the spokes go out to elsewhere in the industry and then beyond,
Mhm.
beyond food places, as you said.
Yeah. So obviously, we're still in some version of this pandemic. Um, and certainly, restaurants are some of the hardest hit portions of the economy during the pandemic. How did Zingerman's, switch gears and be able to navigate the pandemic and come out the other side, um, feeling like they're strong and sustainable and still able to go on?
It's funny because, Paul and Ari would both say that, it's not over yet.
Yeah.
And we're not confident that, that everything is fine. But it was very interesting for me because I was working on the book proposal through the winter of 2020. And we started to hear COVID, China, then they cut off flights from China, then the first cases were popping up in Michigan. And Scribner's, which is my publisher, was very interested in purchasing this book. And we set up a meeting with Ari for March 16th, 2020 to talk about the book project and would they cooperate and that kind of thing. And he got on the phone and he said, "This is the worst day of my life. I just had to lay off 300 people." And they had 700 employees at the time, and they had never laid anyone off. Even in 2008, 2009, they didn't lay anybody off. And so Michigan, as people know, Governor Whitmer closed indoor dining a couple times in that year, and they had to pivot. And this, very interestingly, as I did the research, the deli had never been a place that had done much delivery or some carry out, but I live close enough to get delivery from them. And at the time of the pandemic, it was only about 8% of their business. People wanted to come down to the deli and they didn't mind standing in the long lines to get their food. And right away, overnight, they could no longer come to the deli and get their food. And they had to come up with a way to handle large amounts of orders, more than just the little trickle that they had every day. And I think that was very difficult for people, that they felt like, the deli is really the building and we need the people in the building. We need the people standing in line for an hour and eager to eat the food and staying and eating their sandwiches. And they couldn't do that. And they had to improvise. All the businesses had to improvise. And so the Roadhouse, which is one of their sit-down restaurants, they actually set up kind of an outdoor park out in front of the Roadhouse with different colored picnic tables. And you placed your order and they could run it out to you because you were dining outside, you weren't dining inside. And they went from a full restaurant where people would wait in line or, get a reservation days in advance, to people sitting at picnic tables eating fried chicken, and that wasn't quite what they had envisioned, but they managed to keep going. And I think the business that was most affected by all of this was the mail order business. And that's a really incredible story because mail order was always an important part of Zingerman's. But if you think about it being a $70 million company, when the pandemic started, they were about 16 million of the 70 million, and they went to 26 million very fast. And they were really instrumental in that first year in keeping Zingerman's going, because people wanted their comfort food. They couldn't eat in their favorite restaurants across the country, but they could get their bread and their chocolate and their cans of tuna and their coffee cakes from Zingerman's. And sometimes things were a little delayed, but those happy looking little boxes would arrive and people would feel like something is normal. So the mail order did so well in 2020 and 2021 that they were able to pay bonuses to the people at Zingerman's who had bought Zingerman's stock. And they just said, here, just take some of our profits and pay the stockholders. And they did.
Great. Yeah, I was one of those people sitting at the picnic tables out there.
Yeah.
It was a way to be able to be out there. And one of the things I love about their mail order stuff too is they still have that personal touch, even with mail order, which doesn't have any personal interaction at all. There's almost
You can
always
call them though. I mean, the catalog and the website, a lot of people have questions, and there are
yeah,
literally like operators standing by
yeah, for
to
sure. Yeah.
answer questions. So I think people would call up, just to talk to somebody at that
Yeah.
moment in time.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, I see a comment in there that someone has said, yeah, I sent my daughter in DC a 4-pack of Zingerman's corned beef sandwiches with all the
Oh,
fixing. Somebody sent me that too, and it
wow.
was so great to be able to
Oh,
make that at
wow.
home.
Yeah.
And you get that handwritten note in there from whoever packed it up.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
when it was kind of those really darker days of the pandemic, especially, it was so nice to have that kind of
Oh,
touch.
sure. Yeah.
One of the other comments in the chat is someone saying, I heard that they had a plan to donate a portion of their earnings from the business to charity from the beginning.
Oh,
Can you talk a
absolutely.
little bit about what
Yeah.
they do with that?
So one of the very cool parts of Zingerman's is food gatherers, and food gatherers started in 1989. So if you figure that Zingerman started in 1982, and let's just say the first 5 years or so were kind of bumpy, as soon as they cut through the cloud layer and they were sailing a little smoothly, they started a charity. And so food gatherers is actually about a mile. Their office is about a mile from me on the northeast side of Ann Arbor. And what they do is they go around to restaurants and grocery stores in Ann Arbor, and they pick up untouched food. So loaves of bread and fruit and sometimes meat and cheeses and things like that. And then they take it to food banks, and the food banks can repackage it into boxes and little grocery counters and things like that for people who were in need. And to me, I mean, I go into some grocery stores and I look at those deli sections and I think, what happens to this food if nobody buys it? Well, food gatherers is one of the way for like the bread and other things to be repurposed. And they have an annual benefit for food gatherers, and it's grown into quite an enterprise. And during the pandemic, there were so many people in Washtenaw County that were food insecure. And I have to be honest, I mean, things got a little dry for journalists in that period. And I actually went to a food bank and thought, no, I have to let it go to other people. I don't, I should just let people truly in need do it. But I thought about it. And a lot of people, we have a mosque in my neighborhood, and people were lined up down the street with their cars to get food boxes. And so the demand for food gatherers during the pandemic just soared. And I think it's one of the most notable parts of Zingerman's. And they started doing it more than 30 years ago.
Yeah, it's a very cool thing that they do. So, I think one of the things that I shared with you before we came on is how much I really like Zingerman's myself.
Yeah,
And
sure.
being at the bookstore where it's like within eyeshot, it's pretty hard to resist going over to the Roadhouse. I could,
Oh, yeah.
if and I love going in there. One of the things that's clear in this book is that you had some really personal connections to Zingerman's and some really neat experiences there. Could you talk about just a few of those? And
Yeah. So one of the things that obviously I do is take classes. Those classes have just taught me everything to know about food. I have never worked in a restaurant, but I do understand how dishes get put together. And what I would do is I would go to the Roadhouse and I would sit, there's a front counter that faces the kitchen. And I like took the seat on the very right hand side, and I just sit there watching them. I didn't know I was going to be writing a book at that point, but I would talk to the hosts, the hostesses, I would talk to the bus people, I would talk to the servers, I would wave at Maria in the kitchen. Bob the chef would come out and chat with me. And it was really a great education. It still is in the way restaurants are run. I got to go to the bakehouse. This is one of my favorite days of research, because Amy Emberling, who's one of the managing partners at the bakehouse, let me come out for a day and just kind of shadow the bakers. And I spent time in the cake decorating area, and I'm watching them make these tiny little flowers out of gum paste, which is edible. And then I watched the line that makes the coffee cakes. And my goodness, I mean, if you've ever made a coffee cake at home, those are like miniature coffee cakes compared with the ones Zingermans is making. And they put them in those big heavy bundt pans and put in the ingredients and the batter and more ingredients and more batter, and then they put them on huge cookie trays and put them on racks, and then slide the rack into like an oven. It's an oven, but it looks like a refrigerator door, sort of. You open it up, put the rack in, set the timer, and the coffee cakes come out. I watched them making bread, which is really interesting. And the people who work there are a whole mix of folks. So they have what's called an externship with the Culinary Institute of America. So you go to CIA for a year, and then your second year you spend basically at a company or a restaurant or whatever. And so they take CIA people for their externships. You've got CIA people, you've got people from Schoolcraft College here in suburban Detroit. I met a young woman who had an engineering degree from Michigan. She had just graduated and she was working on the bread line because she wanted to make bread. There are people that don't have a college degree that have been working there for years and years and years, and it's just all kinds of people from all walks of life. My Pilates teacher's two sons have worked the temporary holiday help at the bakehouse, and then one of them has gotten hired as a permanent baker. So it's a really fascinating. I mean, you could just pull up a chair and spend like a week there. And they do have these classes called bakecations, where you can actually spend a week baking at, not in the bakehouse, but learning how to bake. And so I thought that was a very cool experience.
Yeah. And you talked also, they really have become part of that global food conversation as well. And you talked a little bit about, their desire to have the best of whatever it is that they are offering, whether it be in the cheese case or the different oils that they have and things like that. How has that kind of evolved over time?
Well, it was interesting because I had asked, Ari is known for global travels and knowing all these people around the world. And he told me he didn't really go anywhere until about 1990. So like 8 years into Zingermans, he took one of his first trips, which was to Ireland, to Ballymaloo, which is a famous cookery school, as they say in Ireland. And the Allen family. So there was Muriel Allen, who passed away a couple of years ago. She was the matriarch. And then now Dorina Allen is kind of the middle generation, and her daughter-in-law, Rachel, is a cooking teacher there. And the Allens taught Ari all kinds of things about farm to table, because it's a farm. And literally, he grew up in Chicago in the suburbs. He said he was eating Kraft Dinner and, and Cheetos. And here he is on a farm in Ireland, collecting eggs and watching them make cheese and bread and things like that. So I think that was a formative experience for him. And then all of the Zingermans managing partners, if they want to go out around the world and look for products, across the country, around the world. Grace Singleton, who is a managing partner at the deli, she's gone on like Parmigiano Reggiano trips to Italy, where they go and they visit these producers and they taste the Parmesan of like 1 year, 5 year, 10 years, that sort of thing. Same with the balsamic vinegar, same with the olive oil. And so, a lot of people will look at the things on the shelves and they'll get confused and they don't know, what do I take? What do I pick? Well, the folks that work in the deli are schooled in what all those different things are, and they'll come over. And they used to be able to give you a taste right there, and they may now be able to do that again. But during the pandemic, they had to give you something to take home. But they can tell you the difference between all of the olive oils, all the vinegars. I overheard a conversation where a customer wanted to know about pepper, and the salesperson was telling him about the pepper, and then the guy in the bread box and the bread area chimed in, and they're all having this conversation about pepper. And the same thing with cheeses. Well, I think my favorite story though was they were trying to devise a hot cocoa coffee cake, and they tried 50 different kinds of hot chocolate before they settled on the hot chocolate that would go in the coffee cake. Well, I was in the Roadhouse one day, and my book had just come out, and one of my favorite servers came over with one of those little bags, and she said, "We want to give you this." And inside of it was the hot cocoa coffee cake. It's really good. And I have to say to people, I don't get to eat for free. People will give me certain things or throw something, "Oh, we want you to try this," that sort of thing. I've probably spent tens of thousands of dollars at Zingerman's on my own over the years, but I do get little snuck little samples of things every so often.
Yeah, that is a really great cake.
Yeah.
Uh, so one of the things that I thought was is pretty neat about the way that their community of businesses are put together is that whole idea of the managing partners having so much control, and kind of coming from this point of view of, if you have an idea, present it, and you never know what's going to happen. Right. Can you talk a little bit about how those are organized and how they get started sometimes?
Yeah, so the whole idea of these Zingerman's community of businesses came about around 1992. Ari and Paul were faced with the situation where the deli was starting to be replicated. Like, ideas were being stolen, and they got in a big lawsuit with Amir's, which is another deli in Ann Arbor, which is still open. And they accused Amir's of copying them, and Amir's shot back and said, you can't patent a deli. I mean, delis have black and white floors, and delis have sandwiches, and they went at it for years until they finally reached a settlement. But Paul was afraid that as Zingerman's became distinctive, that distinctive was easy to copy. And so he wanted Zingerman's to keep growing. And Ari didn't really want it to keep growing. He was really happy with the original deli and with the one location in Ann Arbor, and he wanted to travel and he wanted to do his writing. And so finally, they kind of came to an agreement on the idea of growth through what they called a community of businesses. And I don't know if people are familiar with Henry Ford and his cottage industries, but being a former automotive writer, I have to explain that. So Henry Ford had the big factory, the Rouge, in Dearborn, and he'd had factories in Detroit, but he noticed that his employees would be gone during harvest. And he was kind of tracing this, and he realized that there were all these small towns in Michigan and Ohio where these farmers were coming from to work at Ford, or Fords as they call it here, but then they disappear in October. And he thought, well, maybe I should have factories in those towns so that I don't lose everybody. Every time there's a harvest, they can go harvest and then come back to work for me until the spring or whatever. And so he opened all these little satellite factories in Manchester and Saline and towns in I think there might be one around Kalamazoo. There was one all the way far as Louisiana, from what I understand. And they would be this little satellite network, and it spread forward across the landscape. So Ari and Paul started thinking, well, what can we do that can be like a community for Zingermans? And they came up with this concept of the community of businesses. And the first one was the bakehouse. The mail order was one, coffee was one. Now there's the creamery and candy, and there's Zing Train, and the several others. The Roadhouse counts as part of Z-Cob is what they call it. And the idea was that someone working there could be the managing partner, and the managing partner would have to put in some money. And if they didn't have money, Zingermans would lend them the money, but they wanted them to truly have ownership. And it's a very interesting arrangement because some of the people had nothing to put in and they got a loan. Some people had all the money to put in, and that actually didn't work too well for Zingermans because Ari and Paul still wanted to have a little chunk of the business. They get licensing fees, so they don't get paid profits. They get paid a licensing fee from Zingerman's Candy, to use the Zingerman's name. And so most of the partners have a little money to put in, and then they keep earning and putting back in and things like that. And the idea is that all the businesses have at least one managing partner. Some have as many as three, and they make the decisions. They run the business. There is the umbrella of the community of businesses, and they all meet every couple weeks or so to talk about how things are going across Zingerman's. But essentially, like if you work for the bakehouse, your business is the bakehouse, and you can get access to the information, the financial information, and the strategic information, and the future direction, and all that. And the managing partners are right there, and you can ask them questions about businesses. So I think it's a really interesting concept. I think for me as a journalist trying to write about this, one of the problems I ran into was that because they're individual businesses, they aren't uniform across. And so even if you read their different websites, they have different explanations of basically the same thing. And I had said, well, you could get somebody in here like a smart MBA and they could standardize all this. And they all kind of said, no, because if we standardize it all, then it loses that unique character, which is what we definitely want as Zingermans. So if you're a business expert and you read about Zingermans, you might think, all right, they're reinventing the wheel every time they start a new business. But to them, they feel that that kind of ownership is very important, and they wouldn't want to do it a different way.
Yeah, I would think, it is one of those things that's sort of hard to wrap your head around a little bit because, to use some of the verbiage from some of their other business books, you kind of have to have that little bit of an anarchist mentality, right?
Yeah.
And
Well, Ari, calls himself a lapsed anarchist, and he doesn't mean let's, take bombs and throw them through windows or anything. I mean, he wants the people to have a voice. And
absolutely, yeah. And so unless you kind of start from scratch and let that happen organically, it would lose that. So you're right.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if you would do it again. I mean, and people have asked me this, like, would they do it exactly the same way if they were to do it now? And I think Paul said that one of the learnings of the pandemic was that they didn't have enough cash. That if he had it to do over again, he would have way more. Nobody knew. But if like right now, like we're in a war situation, gas prices are going up, and gasoline affects the food industry like nobody's business. And so I'm sure that they want their cash position to be healthy, so that if they ever run into any, this thing just keeps going on and on and on. If we ever get another variant that's even worse than the ones we've had, they want these businesses to survive.
So not to get into anything that's not positive, but were there any parts of Zingerman's history with some of the businesses that maybe were harder or or didn't work out or anything like that?
Yeah, I mean, they've had a couple businesses that have been challenges. So they're actually a produce company. So
Mm.
they started the deli in early 80s, and then they decided they would run a produce business over at the Carytown Market building. And it
Oh,
was a total disaster. And like, there's only a few of us that actually remember Zingerman's produce, but the produce, the fruit and vegetable business and the grocery business is way different from the specialty food
mm,
business. I mean, produce goes bad,
yeah.
and you have to have a constant first in, first out sort of situation. It's hard for farmers, let alone, two guys who met at the University of Michigan. So Zingerman's Produce is one of the businesses that I think they'd like to just forget. Coffee has had a bit of trouble because the coffee business got started later than specialty coffee. Like Starbucks was, let's see, Starbucks started in 84. So Starbucks was as old as the deli when coffee got started around 2000, and coffee bumped along for about a decade where it was just selling kind of a small amount. And actually the coffee business at the deli was enough to justify it. But there was this whole wholesale coffee business that they were missing out of. And so they brought in a second partner for the coffee business to try to boost that. Candy the same way. I mean, candy was started because one of the guys loved candy bars and he wanted to make candy bars, and they're really good candy bars, but they're, $6 candy bars, and they were, people were just not used to spending that. Now I think chocolate is a whole market unto itself, but back then they were probably 10 years ahead of what's happened in the chocolate market, so that hasn't been that easy for them. The creamery was really difficult because the creamery got started to make cream cheese for the bagels and for the sandwiches, and then it expanded into different kinds of cheeses. But the FDA set up a new set of standards for creameries. I think that would have been in the not that long ago, and they had to invest a whole ton of money into the cream. They had to kind of make a decision, like, do we keep making our own cheese? And they did. But lo and behold, which is one of my favorite stories in the book, there's a young man named Aaron Elston whose family owns a dairy farm up towards where central Michigan is. So kind of not too far from Mount Pleasant. I think it might be closer to St. John, but they were there. It's an organic dairy farm, and they were looking for someone to take milk. And he went and he's a wealth manager. He grew up there, but then he went off to business school and he's working in the wealth business. And he asked around, and somebody said, you should meet with Plum Market. And he went and met with Plum Market, and Plum Market said, well, we buy from the Horizon Collective, but we have this partnership with Zingermans, and you ought to go talk to Zingermans. So he went and talked to Zingermans, and they hit it off so well that he invested in the creamery, and now he's the managing partner for the creamery. He left the business of big finance and moved from Chicago to Ann Arbor, and now he's making cheese. And they're really ramping up the cheese products in the creamery. I mean, as these new people come in who've had some experiences in business other than Zingerman's, they're bringing a lot of fresh ideas with them, and they still have to go through what Zingerman's calls the path to partnership. It's an 18-month program, and you spend time in every business and you learn something about the Zingerman's philosophy and history and all that. So they get indoctrinated into the Zingerman's way of doing things, but they bring maybe a more contemporary, fresh look at business into Zingerman's. And I think it's helped those businesses quite a lot.
Oh, it must. That's so great. Well, I think I've reached the ends of the questions in the chat and the ones that I had prepared. Are there any things that we didn't talk about the book that you would want to make sure that we don't miss?
Yeah, well, thanks for asking. I think a couple things. One of the things I'm going to be very interested in seeing is what happens to Zingerman's from here on out, because Paul Saginaw is actually living in Las Vegas now. He started his own deli called Saginaw's in a big expensive resort called Circa on the downtown part of Las Vegas. And for the last couple of years, he's been out in Vegas, and he's still co-founder, and he's on the phone or Zoom calls, every single day, but his physical presence is not there. And Ari is the co-founder who's on site, and he also is managing partner for the restaurant, for the Roadhouse, which I think is very challenging. And he writes too. He writes his newsletters and all that. And so I think they're trying to figure out the way that they will transition out of Zingerman's and turn it over to the managing partners. And the interesting thing is, Zingerman's, if it wanted to sell, which does not, they could very easily find a buyer. Blue Bottle Coffee from San Francisco started as a single coffee cart in the 00, so like 2004, I think it was, and they were sold for $724 million to one of the big coffee companies. And so I've talked to finance people who say the Zingerman's brand, even though it's a $70 million revenue company, the brand itself is probably worth $1 billion. Now, Paul says it will never be sold, that the plan is to have the managing partners collectively own Zingerman's. And I think there's about 24 managing partners. So you would have a collective. I think that has to be structured. I don't think they're anywhere near ready to do that. The other thing that's been talked about, and I kind of was waved off asking about it at an event last week, but there have been discussion of selling a type of stock that would be at risk. And so the public could buy into Zingerman's, totally is like a share, not a public offering, but, like a certificate of Zingerman's, and you would see the value of it go up and down, and you might get a bonus at the end of the year, and you might not get a dividend at the end of the year. It would totally depend on how the company did on the measurements that it uses to sell the stock. That's really complicated because Zingerman's ownership is a little screwy. So there's an entity called Dancing Sandwiches, which is owned by Paul and Ari, and they have the licensing rights to 35 different businesses, and they get fees from those businesses for the Zingerman's name, and that's how they get paid. So it's kind of a complicated company, and especially when you think about publicly held companies that are $70 million, it's not that complicated. You have a CEO, a chairman, a board, and senior management, and that's it. But it's just a plain old corporation, and this is something completely different. So I think that's going to be something that we all will be watching. I also think that, even though Zingerman's is physically still in Ann Arbor, I think they would like to expand some of their products for the retail market. They do a lot of business with Plum Market now, and Plum has stores in Chicago, so you can see Zingerman's products in Chicago. Before the pandemic, they were selling their coffee to airports all over the country, and I think that's bouncing back. And then independent cafes were buying Zingerman's coffee, and the independents are kind of coming back. And then colleges and universities have had students come back to campus, and those cafeterias that buy Zingerman's coffee are getting that business back. So I think what we'll see in the next couple of years, assuming the pandemic is kind of where it is or improves, I think you'll be seeing Zingerman's in more places, even though Zingerman's will stay in one place.
Yeah. So the last thing that I'll ask you before we wrap up is if you have any projects that you're working on that will result in a book in the future.
So I'm really fascinated by all the Zingerman's leadership concepts, and this is way down the road, and I haven't even had a conversation with Zingerman's about it yet, but I think that more can be written about their leadership and their philosophy of leadership, and motivating staff and bringing staff into the conversation. And I read a lot of books on leadership, and my conclusion after doing this is there's nobody else like Zingerman's really, even though Zingerman's was inspired by quite a lot of other businesses. I think it's put it all together to become a unique entity. So we'll see. I mean, my book's only been out for a month, and it's on audiobook, it's on books on CD, there's an e-version, and then it'll eventually go to paperback, and then we'll see what happens after that. So it'll stay tuned. It'll be a little while.
Okay. Well, I just want to really thank you so much for being with us tonight. It was great to talk with you, with this audience listening along. Again, I really, really enjoyed the book.
Oh, great. Thank you.
And I hope that any of you that have joined us that haven't picked up a copy of the book yet, I really encourage you to go do that wherever you buy books. And if it is helpful, we have the link again in the chat to buy them from us. And this was just a really fun way to spend my evening talking with you about this fabulous book. So thank you so much, Mickey.
Oh, I know now we're all now hungry. So
yeah.
Thank you. It was really fun.
Oh, thanks. Well, I will see you the next time and look forward to seeing you in the store.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.